Well, we're in the book of Numbers, and like the others, we're going to race through and hopefully not get bogged down. It's a pity the book was ever called Numbers. It's come from the Septuagint version, the Greek translation, and it's come from the Greek word arithmoi, from which we get the word arithmetic. I'm sure Alex knew that. And it's not a good name really, because basically the person who came up with that name was looking at just two events in it. There were two censuses. Oh dear. Anyway, whatever I should have said. The first was in chapter 1 in relation to the first generation that didn't make it to the promised land. The second was in chapter 26 when they were counted again, and that was the second generation that did get into the promised land. The Hebrew title, which I think is much better, is In the Wilderness, because this is the events of the children of Israel in the wilderness. Let's just recap very quickly. Jacob's family had grown considerably by the end of Genesis. As you know, they were taken into slavery for 400 years. They make an exit, hence the name Exodus, from the land of Egypt, and they come to Mount Sinai and spend over a year there, where God gives them the law concerning every area of life. He instructs them to build a place for him, to live with them, and for them to worship at. And now is the time to start traveling when we get to Numbers. And it's an 11-day journey, as we know. It's a bit like walking to Birmingham from here and taking 40 years. I mean, it must have been a terrible, terrible, terrible ordeal. I feel sorry for Moses, don't you? I really feel sorry for the man. It took them 38 years and 10 months. And I mentioned one Sunday about that man at the pool of Bethesda for 38 years. I think there's some significance there, but we haven't got any time to go into that at the moment. There were these two censuses then in chapter 1 and 26. And the book of Numbers demonstrates that when God makes a covenant, he keeps it. Even if the people don't, even if that first generation aren't going to be obedient, then God will take the second generation in. Chapter 1, let's just look at that for a moment. Now the Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai in the tabernacle of meeting on the first day of the second month in the second year after they had come out of the land of Egypt, saying, take a census of all the congregation of the children of Israel by their families, by their fathers' houses, according to the number of names, every male individually from 20 years old and above, all who are able to go to war in Israel. You and Aaron shall number them by their armies, and with you there shall be a man from every tribe, each one the head of his father's house. So this census is prepared. It's really a conscript. These men are being conscripted into the army. They're 20 and above. And then you've got this long list of the heads, as it were, of the various tribes. And the tally was 603,560 men who were able to go to war, out of an estimated 3 million people. Now just remember this. In Egypt, they'd just been slaves. They'd been nameless slaves. And it's interesting, in the Bible, God begins to name. He names them. And I've been thinking about this. He knows your name, Jane, all right? John, he knows your name. He knows your name. He knows our names. That's the level of the intimacy with God. He knows us. He knows your name now. He knows your name, David. He knows each one of us by name. Praise his name. And he loves and values each one of us. St. Augustine said this, God loves each one of us as though there were only one to love. I don't know whether you've ever read the story of St. Augustine. He was a terrible, terrible young man. When Sheila prays for our relatives or people we know, she says, Lord, if you can save St. Augustine, you can save my children. All right, not that she's comparing them, but she's looking at the ability of God to take a real reprobate of a man and make him God's own. So that census is organised. And then the 12 tribes are divided into 4 camps. And if you look at your notes, you will know this, I'm sure. There are 3 tribes on each side of the tabernacle. So you've got 4 lots of 3. Thank you. Your wife's already kindly done that. Thank you. Thank you. So you've got the 4 tribes, and you'll notice that they're named according to the largest tribe, except in the case of Reuben. So you've got at the north, the camp of Dan, which includes Dan, Asher, and Naphtali. And so you've got all the 12 tribes divided into 4 sets of 3. Now to the east, each camp had a standard, a banner featuring the lead tribe's emblem. So there was an emblem of Dan, an emblem of Ephraim, an emblem of Judah. To the east, Judah's flag featured a lion. Now that should tell you something, shouldn't it? To the west, Ephraim's flag featured an ox. To the south, Reuben's flag featured a man. And to the north, Dan's flag featured an eagle. The Levites were in the middle of it all. You can see them there. They're divided into 4, those 4 groups inside. And they were the Levites. They were the people who served in the tabernacle. Now you know from Hebrews that the tabernacle is a model of heaven. That's what the writer tells us. You might also say that this is a model of God's throne. Do you remember the story? You remember Ezekiel's vision in chapter 1? He has this incredible vision of a chariot. It's like a chariot anyway. And it's borne by 4 peculiar creatures, cherubim, we know. And they've got 4 faces each. And, the wheels and the eyes, they can go in any direction. It's like wheels within wheels. And as soon as the Spirit tells them to move, they move. There's a good lesson there for us. And he sees this, and this is what it says. Well, the 4 faces are the faces of an eagle, a lion, an ox, and a man. So you've got it there again. And let me just read from Ecclesiastes. It's in chapter 1. And in the fire was what looked like 4 living creatures. In appearance their form was human, but each of them had 4 faces and 4 wings. Their legs were straight, their feet were like those of a calf and gleamed like burnished bronze. Under their wings on the 4 sides they had human hands. All 4 of them had faces and wings, and the wings of one touched the wings of another. Each one went straight ahead. They did not turn as they moved. Their faces looked like this. Each of the 4 had the face of a human being. On the right side, each had the face of a lion. On the left, the face of an ox. Each also had the face of an eagle. And you remember there was someone sitting on that chariot in blue. It was God, with the appearance of a man, says Ezekiel. Isn't that wonderful? Got this strange chariot. But there it is. It's a picture, you might say, of the throne of God. And then in Revelation, you read it again in chapter 4. The same thing. Before the throne, there was a sea of glass like crystal. In the midst of the throne and around the throne were 4 living creatures, full of eyes in front and in the back. The first living creature was like a lion. The second like a calf, that's an ox. The third living creature had a face like a man. And the 4th living creature was like a flying eagle. Isn't God consistent? Everything adds up as you go through the scriptures. And we had this read on Sunday morning. The 4 living creatures, each having 6 wings, were full of eyes around and within, and they do not rest day or night, saying, Holy, 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 Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. And then you've got this in the four Gospels. You've got Matthew, which shows the Lion of the tribe of Judah. That's him fulfilling Hebrew prophecy. You've got Mark, that very short and pithy gospel, when you keep reading the words immediately, and it's showing Jesus as a servant, and the word and the ox, of course, is the ancient beast of service. And then you've got Luke the doctor. He highlights the humanity of Jesus, the Son of Man, focusing more on his humanity than the other gospel. And then John portrays the deity of Jesus, the creator and sustainer of everything, the eagle. Hallelujah. Isn't it wonderful? What is heaven going to look like? John just gets these glimpses and writes it down, and Ezekiel writes it down as best he can. And, let's remember this. Those sights are merely, they are not the glory of God. They are how can I say this? The glory of God is his character. That's the glory of God. The glory of God resides in his character, who he is. But you've got these wonderful visions, these lights, these storms, these lightnings, and so on. And then there's the tribe of Levi, chapters 3 and 4, led by Aaron, not counted in the first census. They had their own numbering attended to, and the four, Gershon, Kohath, Merari, Moses and Aaron. And then God consecrates the community in chapter 5. He imposes rules which seem rather unfair, seems rather hard, about cleanliness. People are put out of the camp if they've got various diseases or if they've touched a corpse. But God is quarantining. Haven't we seen that now? He's practical. God is practical as well as personal. And then in chapter 6 you've got the Nazarites. Now these are ordinary Old Testament believers who decide to take a special vow and dedicate themselves to the Lord. And this was entirely voluntary. You could do it, anyone could do it. And it was normally for a specific period of time. And the Hebrew word Nazir means separate. And so it involved practices that showed that they were separate from everyone else. You know, the most famous Nazarite probably was Samson and Samuel. And it looks as if Paul himself might have taken a Nazarite vow in Acts 18, verse 18. There were three things they could not do. They could have nothing to do with the grapevine. They couldn't drink anything in connection with the grape. Why do you think that is? It's as much speculation from many of us. We don't know, but it seems that wine was associated with things that were not good, but they couldn't have grape juice, grapes, or even raisins, the scripture says. And perhaps that's, associated with a fermented grape and the things that flow from that. They couldn't have their hair cut, and they couldn't have contact with a dead body or even attend a funeral. So that was the Nazarite. The things they had to do, they had to be, they were called to personal godliness, given to the worship of God and the study of his word, and actively involved in the community. Now, how are we to live in the new covenant? I think it's best expressed in Romans 12, and we've been here before so many times. I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is your reasonable worship. Oh, that we might get this definition of worship and stick with it, instead of thinking it's just singing. That's our reasonable worship, to present our bodies an acceptable. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. And then in chapter 7 and 8, Moses anoints and sanctifies the tabernacle and gives the prominent Levite families the things they need to carry out their offices. And Moses and Aaron purify their sons, make burnt offerings, and the years of active service, which my wife keeps reminding me about, are between 25 and 70, and 50, and 50. And some of us have passed that a long time ago, probably all of us. No, yes, sorry. You don't have to. You don't have to show your birth certificates. But that was it. Now, if you turn to chapter 9, and let's read verses 15 to 18, or in the notes you can. Now, on the day that the tabernacle was raised up, the cloud covered the temple, the tent of the testimony, from evening until morning. It was above the tabernacle like the appearance of fire. So it was always the cloud covered it by day and the appearance of fire by night. Whenever the cloud was taken up from above the tabernacle, after that the children of Israel would journey, and in the place where the cloud settled, there they would pitch their tents. At the command of the Lord, the children of Israel would journey, and at the command of the Lord, they would camp as long as the cloud stayed above the tabernacle. They remained camped. That'd be rather nice, wouldn't it? In a way, if you could discern the will of God by the presence of a cloud, you could give your job up when the cloud moved. You could move house when the cloud moved. You just have all that. And as soon as the cloud moved, they moved. But of course, we got something much better than that. We've actually got inside us the guide. Not just that we're getting guidance, we have the guide inside of us. Now they call that the Shekinah glory, which just means residence. And they had to move whenever the cloud moved. That's why, when people say, have you got a 5-year plan? Well, I think it's best if you don't have one. Seems to me contrary to the will of God. The Jews have got a saying, man makes plans and God laughs. That's one of their... 5-year plan. People sometimes say to me, well, what's your 5-year plan? My answer is, I may not even be alive. Sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof. All we're promised is... Well, we're not even promised the next breath, actually, are we? But today is all we've got, really. Well, the complaining begins... and continues. And if you look at chapter 11, when the people complained, it displeased the Lord. When the Lord heard it, I was thinking about this today, when the Lord heard it, he hears all our complaining. I was thinking of Gordon Brown. Do you remember Gordon Brown, when he kept the microphone on? He talked to that woman, and then he got into the car, and we heard him say, wasn't that woman a bigot? Do you remember that? So we all heard it. Well, God hears all our murmurings. God hears all our complainings. And his anger burned, so the fire of the Lord burned among them and consumed some of the outer parts of the camp. When the people cried to Moses, he prayed to the Lord, and the fire died out. So he called the name of that place Tabernacle, because there the fire of the Lord burned among them. Now the mixed multitude who were among them yielded to intense craving. So the children of Israel also wept again and said, who will give us meat to eat? We remember the fish when we ate freely in Egypt, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. But now our whole being is dried up. There is nothing at all except this manna before our eyes. Just think what they'd seen, these people. Just think what they'd experienced, the crossing of the Red Sea, the provision of water, the provision of bread. Now they want meat. God gives them meat as well. Very, very soon the quails are going to come along. But their faith really should have been rock solid, you'd have thought. Now who's this mixed multitude? Well, some of those Israelites in Egypt had married Egyptians. And some of those people came out in the Exodus, and it was them particularly, that were complaining. The mixed multitude. They were quite wealthy by the look of it, because the Bible tells us they got flocks and herds and a great deal of livestock. I suppose in any church you're going to get a mixed multitude, you know, and we need to be very careful we don't get influenced by the mixed multitude. There are always hangers-on. There are. You just have to face it. There always are hangers-on. There are people who purport to be part of the body, but they're just hangers-on. And we need to be very careful that we're not influenced by those. I've just put here 6 things that the Lord hates, by the way. Yes, 7 are an abomination to him: a proud look, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that devises wicked plans, feet swift in running to evil, a false witness who speaks lies, and one who sows discord among the brethren. So the point is, God hears. God hears. And then there's another complaint, this time from Miriam and Aaron. These are people who are right at the top of the leadership, as it were, because Moses had married an Ethiopian woman. And they said, well, who do you think you are, really? Do you think the Lord has just spoken through you? And, well, there was something, I'm trying to remember what didn't she get leprosy? Didn't her skin turn as white as can be? I think I remember that. And Moses prayed for her and God relented, didn't he? So, serious stuff. And then you've got the spies sent to Canaan. 10 spies were sent to spy in Canaan, 12 spies, 2 short. 10 were bad, 2 were good. What did they see to spy in Canaan? 10 were bad, 2 were good. Some saw giants, tough and tall. Some saw the grapes in clusters fall. Some saw God was in it all. We used to sing that and teach the children, didn't we? And he sends out 12, 1 from each tribe. And they were to spy out the land, check out the strength of the opposition and the land, its quality. After 40 days, the spies return and they say this: we went to the land where you sent us. It truly flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. Nevertheless, the people who dwell there in the land are strong. The cities are fortified and very large. Moreover, we saw the descendants of Anak, who were giants. They were huge, a race of gigantic warriors. And you know, so big were the bunch. You go to Tesco's for your grapes, you get them in that little plastic container. And so big were the grapes that it took 2 men to bring 1 bunch back. That's what the Bible tells us. In fact, the ministry of tourism in Israel still has that symbol of 2 men carrying a bunch of grapes. That's how fruitful it was. That's how wonderful it was. But they panicked, and but one of the scouts, Caleb, who incidentally, Caleb, you know, was not a Jew by birth. He was a Gentile. Lots of Gentiles amongst them, and he was one of them. He quieted the people before Moses and said, let us go up at once and take possession, for we are well able to overcome it. And then the other spies, except Joshua, said, but the men who had gone up with him said, we are not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we. And they gave the children of Israel a bad report of the land which they had spied out, saying, the land through which we have gone as spies is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people whom we saw in it are men of great stature. There we saw the giants, the descendants of Anak, came from giants, and we are like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight. And what a miserable lot. And it continued, this complaining. If only we had died in the land of Egypt. You know, that's better than dying here in the wilderness. They even threatened to replace Moses and to go back to Egypt. And at this point, Caleb stands up with Joshua, who would eventually become the leader. So their courageous faith fell on deaf ears, and God steps in, ready to wipe them all out. How about that? Don't we get a false view of God? I once attended a house group in which the leader said, God is no longer angry. So, well, you obviously haven't read the Old Testament, and you certainly haven't read the book of Revelation. But this is the same God. And he's ready to wipe them all out, and Moses interceded, begging God for mercy, and God spared them. But he says this in chapter 14, verse 31, but you, your little ones, whom you said would be victims, I will bring in, and they shall know the land which you have despised. But as for you, your carcasses shall fall in the wilderness. What a terrible thing that was. And except, as you know, for Caleb and Joshua, that whole generation would die in the wilderness. And of course, the writer of the Hebrews mentions this. Now, a prominent Levi, Korah, led a group of 250 other leaders in rebellion against the leadership of Moses. You've got too much power, Moses. Who do you think you are? And God was going to settle it. And Moses sets out the terms. I mean, just look at this. And Moses said, by this you shall know that the Lord has sent me to do these works, for I have not done them of my own will. If these men die naturally, that's the 250 men, like all men, or if they are visited by the common fate of all men, then the Lord has not sent me. But if the Lord creates a new thing, and the earth opens its mouth and swallows them up with all that belongs to them, and they go down alive into the pit, you will understand that these men have rejected the Lord. And God came immediately and did that. The ground opened up and swallowed these men. Makes you think, doesn't it? The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. I'm not talking about a craven fear now. I'm not talking about that. But he's a God to be dealt with, isn't he? And to be accountable to. So God confirms the priesthood through Aaron. And he causes, do you remember, they all had to bring a rod. And in the morning, Aaron's rod not only budded, it had almonds on it. I don't know whether he picked them off and ate them, I don't know, but what a thing, isn't that amazing? What an amazing thing. His rod budded and again vindicated his position as the chosen one of God. Now, chapter 19, there's a special provision. I like to think of this like instant coffee. Please forgive me if that sounds... But there was a provision from God to deal with sin while they were traveling and couldn't carry out the sacrifices. It was sort of an instant cleansing. And it was called the Red Heifer. Yeah, I'm sure you've heard of this. The Red Heifer. They had to find a heifer, that is a cow that hasn't had any calves. And it had to be red, and they were rare. So they got to find this special red heifer. And they were to kill it. And the whole of it had to be burnt. And its ashes mixed with cedar wood, hyssop and scarlet. And that water was taken on their travels so that sin could be dealt with when they couldn't have the tabernacle erected. God thought of everything. And doesn't that just teach us that wherever we are, whatever time we are, we have access to God and His grace? I'm sorry if that instant coffee comment, I don't mean that to be trivial. I'm just saying it was a way of, mixing with water and being an acceptable means of cleansing. Well, Moses makes a big mistake. They arrive again at Kadesh, where he'd sent out the 12 spies. Imagine that. You've wandered round for 37 years since you've sent out the spies. You've come back to the same place. And all they've done is just wandered faithlessly. And this time they're complaining about the lack of water. And you know the story. God says, speak to the rock. Don't hit it like you did last time. Speak to it. You know, you don't need me to... You know that there is a figure, a type in that. Jesus was struck and out came water. Now, what we do is speak to him. I think God guards these types very, very jealously, it seems to me. And what Moses did, he loses his temper. And who can blame him? And instead of just going and speaking to the rock, he rebukes the people. He says this, hear now, you rebels, must we bring water for you out of this rock? Then Moses lifted his hand and struck the rock twice with his rod, and water came out abundantly, and the congregation and their animals drank. And the consequence of that action was that he did not go into the promised land. Well, I don't know what you make of that. I thought about it often. One of my favourite teachers, in which I learnt most as a young man, was Campbell Morgan. And I've just put down a quote there, which I think is quite helpful, if you wanted to read that. And then you come to the situation where, they're still complaining. And he sends venomous snakes into the camp. And the people come to Moses and they plead with him to take the snakes away. And God's response was to have a metal snake, a bronze snake, put on a pole. And he said, if you look at this, you'll live. And I'll just put a picture there. I mean, can you imagine just people are lying around sick, they're dying, and someone's pleading with them, just look and live. That's our plea now, actually, for the gospel. Look and live. Just look and live. And you know, Jesus talks very much, he talks in John 3 about this when he's talking about the gospel, you know. Incidentally, it's very important when you read John 3:16 to read those earlier verses. Very important indeed. If you just snatch that verse out, for example, we say, for God so loved the world, he so loved the world. That's not what it says. It means this, he loved the world in the same way as he did then. In the like manner, he so loved the world. But we take a verse, you see, and we make of it what we will. It's important to get the context, important to look back at the Old Testament. And I often think, you know, well, this is too deep now. There's a snake on the cross. That's too deep for me. I can't go there. What does that mean? What did Jesus mean by that? I mean, it's almost too deep and solemn to enter into for me. But he's talking about his crucifixion. And then we come to Balaam and the talking donkey. I love this story, don't you? The people of God had a reputation for being quite victorious when they were fighting the various people, the Canaanites, the Amorites, and Og, the king of Bashan. And the next in line was Moab, and their king called Balak. And he was dead scared. He'd seen what the people of Israel had done to these other people. And so he decides to hire a sorcerer by the name of Balaam, a prophet, probably used astrology, divination. other means to create oracles and signs. I've been thinking about this as well, the mixture of the profane with the holy. Maybe he even had some kind of religious understanding, maybe understood something of God, but there was a mixture clearly in this man. And Balak the king said, Balaam, will you please put a curse on Israel? Now that often happened apparently in those days. The king would ask a prophet to curse the enemy. And God speaks to Balaam and tells him not to curse Israel. But Balak tries to persuade him to change his mind, and he says, not for all the money in the world will I curse them. All the silver and gold, he said, could not persuade him to go against Israel's God. So he clearly had some contact with Israel's God, it seems to me. So God then sent Balaam on a mission, instructing him to go to King Balak, but say only the word that I speak to you. So he saddles up his donkey, and he's obviously going in the wrong attitude, and God's standing in his way in the form of an angel. But he doesn't see the angel of the Lord, but the donkey does. I love this story, don't you? We were talking the other morning about God speaking to animals. Now here's an animal about to speak to a reluctant prophet. And this happens 3 times. And the donkey, it says, then the Lord opened the mouth. He hit him, you see. Balaam belted him because he kept stopping. And the donkey says, what have I done to you that you should strike me these 3 times? Balaam said to the donkey, because you have abused me. I wish there was a sword in my hand, for now I would kill you. So the donkey said to Balaam, am I not your donkey, on which you have ridden ever since I became yours to this day? Was I ever disposed to do this to you? And he said, no. And then God graciously opens Balaam's eyes to see the angel, and he drops down and bows. Well, now God allows Balaam to continue, the king takes him to 3 high places, and he desperately hopes that he will curse the people, but he can't. And instead it says he took up his oracle and said, Balak, the king of Moab, has brought me from Aram, from the mountains of the east. Come curse Jacob for me. Come denounce Israel. How shall I curse whom God has not cursed? And how shall I denounce whom the Lord has not denounced? For from the top of the rocks I see him, and from the hills I behold him. There are people dwelling alone, not reckoning itself among the nations. Who can count the dust of Jacob, or number 1/4 of Israel? Let me die the death of the righteous, and let my end be like his. Then Balak said to Balaam, what have you done to me? I took you to curse my enemies, and look, you have blessed them bountifully. Did it 3 times. Couldn't curse the people. But unfortunately, and this is referred to in the New Testament, I'm trying to remember which book and I can't, about the sin of Balaam. But it seems that Balaam didn't really keep his word. He didn't curse them, but he arranged for women to go into the camp of Israel, and part of the Moabites, part of their religious rituals involved having sex, and these men were doing just that. Moses says this in chapter 31, have you kept all the women alive? Look, these women caused the children of Israel through the counsel of Balaam to trespass against the Lord in the incidents of Peor. And there was a plague among the congregation of the Lord. So even though he had heard from the Lord, even though he had obeyed the Lord to some extent, he persuaded the king to arrange for this to happen. And then I just finished with there were 24,000 deaths, by the way, resulting from that. 24,000 deaths because God sent a plague. All right, so this first generation finished, failed. Now the second generation in chapters 26 and 36. A new high priest, Aaron's son. And the new generation needed reminding of the offerings and the sacrifices of God. And so you'll see those repeated in those chapters. And eventually God helps them defeat the Midianites. They cross the River Jordan and they finally reached the promised land. Not everyone crossed the Jordan. Some of the tribes of Reuben and Gad and half of Manasseh, asked to stay on the east side of the river, but they also agreed that in the event of a conflict they would take part on the side of Israel. And then finally, it's only 7:45, so I've kept my promise, the cities of refuge. And here we have an illustration of the mercy and the grace of God. Now the law made life sacred, and the punishment for taking a life was death. I don't know whether you have any thoughts about capital punishment. Seems to me it's entirely consistent with the scriptures. Entirely consistent with the scriptures, because the sanctity of life is such. I get very angry when I see judges issue such light judgments when there's been a terrible murder. That's something of our day and generation, which does not recognize the sanctity of life, the value of life. But it was possible if it was a premeditated murder, you've got nowhere to run. But if it was accidental, say, if it was in a war or some extenuating circumstances such as self-defense, God provided these cities that you could go to where you were safe, and you were safe until the high priest died. I don't know what that is. You got any ideas? But you were safe there. There'd be an investigation in the city to make sure that it was an accidental murder, and you were safe until the high priest died. I think that's right. So there it is, Numbers in 50 minutes. Hope that's of help.